Deep in the heart of a wilderness untouched by time, where the mountains clawed at the sky like jagged teeth, stood the silent lodge. Its looming silhouette was barely visible through the thick, swirling snow, as though the storm itself was determined to keep it hidden. The path to the lodge was nothing but a forgotten trail, buried beneath layers of ice and snow, making it feel as though the world itself had abandoned this place. It was a retreat long forgotten by all but the most daring, or the most desperate. Ethan Winters had never been one to shy away from a challenge. A struggling writer plagued by doubt and a constant sense of failure, he believed a change of scenery might ignite the spark he so desperately needed. His wife, Claire, and their 8-year-old son, Lucas, were less certain, but they too longed for a break from their own lives. The lodge, its caretaker position available for the winter season, promised them solitude, peace, and the time to focus on their lives. But solitude in the silent lodge was a dangerous thing, and peace was an illusion. As the Winters family's car rolled up the narrow, snow-covered road, the lodge emerged from the storm's thick veil like a beast awakening from a long sleep. The wind howled, pushing the snow in violent gusts, as if the earth itself was warning them to turn back. But Ethan was undeterred. He could feel the weight of opportunity pressing on him, urging him to take the leap. The lodge loomed before them, towering and ancient, its dark wood warped by decades of neglect. It seemed to breathe, its broken windows like eyes watching them approach, and the sagging roof looked as though it might collapse at any moment. The once grand facade, now cracked and weathered, had an eerie, haunted beauty, as though it had lived 1,000 lifetimes and seen 1,000 stories end. For a moment, a sense of dread settled in Ethan's chest, but he quickly dismissed it. "It's just an old building," he muttered under his breath, trying to shake off the growing unease. But Claire's hand gripped his tighter, and Lucas had grown eerily quiet in the back seat, his gaze fixed on the shadowy form of the lodge. The wind slammed against the car as they stepped out, the cold cutting through their clothes like shards of glass. The silence was oppressive, deeper than the snow, suffocating. The air was so cold it stung their lungs, and the world beyond the lodge seemed swallowed by the storm. The road behind them was barely visible, and the mountains surrounding the lodge rose like looming giants, their jagged peaks obscured by the storm's fury. Inside, the lodge was strangely pristine, as though untouched by the years of abandonment. The heavy silence seemed to press in on them, thick and suffocating. The floorboards creaked under their weight, but otherwise, there was only stillness. The air carried the faint scent of something metallic, something old, and something forgotten. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, the furniture covered with dust and thick white sheets, as though the lodge was in mourning for its lost years. As Ethan ventured deeper into the main hall, the space stretched before them in a vast, unnerving emptiness. The high ceilings seemed to loom over them, stretching toward the darkness, like an immense, suffocating cavern. The light from their lantern flickered across the walls, casting long, warped shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The fire in the hearth had long since died, leaving only a cold, lifeless grate. The air grew colder as they moved farther into the house, the temperature dropping so quickly that Claire shivered, her breath coming out in white puffs that seemed to hang in the air for longer than they should. Lucas, who had been unusually quiet, finally broke the silence. His voice was barely a whisper as he clung to Claire's hand. "Mom, something's wrong here. It feels like the walls are watching us." Claire stopped and looked down at him, trying to reassure him with a smile, but her heart sank at the look on his face. His eyes were wide with fear, his small body trembling as though he were feeling something she couldn't see, something that made her own skin crawl. Ethan, who had been too busy with his own thoughts to notice, waved it off. "It's just an old place, Lucas. Nothing to be afraid of. You're just tired from the drive." His words were meant to be comforting, but they came out strained, as though he, too, could feel the weight of something pressing against him. As night fell, the atmosphere in the lodge became heavier. The wind outside grew fiercer, slamming against the walls like something desperate to get inside. The storm raged beyond the fragile walls, a constant roar that never ceased, as if nature itself were waging war against them. The darkened windows provided no comfort, no connection to the world beyond. It was as though they were in a different world entirely, a world that had forgotten them. The fire in the hearth flickered weakly, casting strange, twisting shadows across the room. The lodge creaked and groaned as though it were alive, each sound more ominous than the last. Lucas seemed to shrink deeper into Claire's side, his eyes darting around the room, as though someone, was waiting for them. Ethan, meanwhile, sat near the fireplace, his mind already lost in his writing. The silence of the lodge was a balm to his fraying nerves, and the crackle of the fire was all the company he needed. He barely noticed Claire's nervous glances or Lucas's quiet mutterings. The ideas flowed from him now, words spilling onto the page with ease, as if the lodge itself were dictating the story. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air was colder than it should have been, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. The creaking of the lodge, once a comforting reminder of its age, now felt like the whispers of something far darker. Something ancient. Something hungry. Outside, the wind howled with such force that it felt as if the lodge might be torn from its foundations. Claire stood up, moving toward the windows, peering out into the storm. But all she saw was darkness. The world beyond was swallowed by the snow, and the night stretched on endlessly, as if there was no dawn to come. Behind her, Lucas's voice broke the silence again. This time, it was a whisper, barely audible. "Mom, there's someone in the hallway." She turned sharply, her pulse quickening. The hallway beyond the living room was dark, the shadows deepening with every passing second. She couldn't see anything. She told herself it was nothing, just the storm playing tricks on her mind. But the unease gnawed at her, growing stronger with each passing minute. Ethan, who had heard Lucas's words, gave a frustrated sigh. "Lucas, there's no one there. It's just the house settling. It's old, that's all." He didn't look up from his writing. But there was a brief flicker of unease in his eyes, a fleeting moment of uncertainty, before he buried himself in his work once again. The first few days passed uneventfully, with Ethan immersing himself in his work. The sound of his typewriter echoed through the cavernous lodge as his fingers flew over the keys, moving frantically, as though some invisible force was guiding his hand. Claire, still trying to settle in, busied herself unpacking their belongings and exploring the lodge's shadowy, forgotten corners. Lucas, however, became increasingly unsettled. The boy wandered the hallways, gazing at the walls with a strange intensity, speaking to them as if they were alive. His soft murmurs often drifted to Claire's ears, but when she asked who he was talking to, he would simply whisper, "The quiet ones." The way he spoke unsettled her, and she tried to brush it off as the imagination of a child. But she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something in the lodge had shifted since their arrival. Even the air inside felt heavier, colder, as though the house was holding its breath. Then, one evening, Claire's search for answers led her to the library. Hidden in a forgotten corner, she found an old, leather-bound journal. The pages were brittle and yellowed with age, but the writing was clear enough. It was a caretaker's journal, and the last entry sent a chill crawling down her spine. "Beware the silent lodge. It sees. It whispers. It takes." Claire stared at the words, her fingers trembling as she read them again. The warning was unmistakable, and yet when she showed it to Ethan, he barely reacted. He was too consumed by his work, his obsession growing with each passing hour. "You're letting this place get to you," he said, barely looking up from his typewriter. "This is our chance, Claire. I need to focus." His dismissal only deepened her unease, but she tried to push her fears aside for the sake of their family. That night, the first nightmare arrived. Lucas woke in the middle of the night, his screams echoing down the cold, empty halls. When Claire rushed to him, she found him trembling in his bed, his wide eyes filled with terror. "There was a man," Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. He had hollow eyes, and a smile, frozen, like ice. Claire searched the room, checking every corner, every shadow, but found nothing. Still, Lucas refused to sleep alone after that night. Something in the air, something in the walls, had changed. And Lucas knew it. Days blurred into weeks, and the strange occurrences continued. Doors slammed shut without warning. Footsteps echoed in empty rooms. Whispers filled the silence, too soft to understand but sharp enough to pierce the air. The lodge had a presence. It was no longer just a place, it was something alive, something watching them. Ethan had changed too. At first, it was subtle, shorter bursts of irritation, a distant look in his eyes, but soon, it was undeniable. His focus on his novel grew into an obsession. He barely spoke to Claire or Lucas anymore, consumed by the rhythmic clack of the typewriter as it became his only companion. Claire would often find him staring blankly at the paper, his hands still, his eyes vacant as though he were listening to something only he could hear. One morning, Claire found the latest pages of his manuscript scattered on the floor. She picked them up, her hands growing cold as she read the words written over and over again. "The lodge needs blood. The lodge must feed." Her stomach churned as she realized that whatever had taken hold of Ethan was more than just his writer's block, it was something darker. Something that had reached into his very soul. And then there were the voices. Soft at first, like a low murmur behind closed doors. But they grew louder each day, and now Ethan would often stand still, his head cocked as if listening to someone just out of reach. Claire could hear him talking to himself at night, words she couldn't make out, as though the lodge itself was whispering to him. It wasn't until the night Claire awoke to find Ethan standing at the foot of their bed that she truly understood the danger they were in. His face was blank, his eyes glassy and unseeing. In his hand, he gripped an axe, its cold, sharp edge gleaming in the moonlight. His voice, when he spoke, was hollow, almost a whisper, but it cut through her like ice.
"The lodge told me the truth,"
he said, his tone eerily calm.
"We can't leave. It won't let us."
Claire's heart raced as she clutched Lucas to her chest, the cold bite of terror creeping into her bones. This wasn't her husband. This wasn't the man she loved. The lodge had taken him, mind, body, and soul. She grabbed Lucas and fled, her breath coming in frantic bursts, the frozen air stinging her lungs as she ran through the dark, twisting halls of the lodge. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadows twisted and shifted, as if the very house itself were alive, trying to trap them. The whispers grew louder, more mocking, as though the lodge was laughing at her futile attempts to escape. The floors creaked underfoot, groaning as if the house was reaching out, eager to claim her. The very air grew colder, a biting chill that sunk deep into her skin. They reached the kitchen, where Claire grabbed the first weapon she could find, a sharp kitchen knife, its cold blade slipping easily into her shaking grip. She turned just in time to see Ethan standing in the doorway, his eyes wild and unfocused, the same cold light in them.
"You can't fight it, Claire. The lodge has chosen us."
The words hit her like a punch to the gut. The lodge had chosen them. There was no escape now. The walls seemed to close in around her as Ethan stepped forward, his axe raised. The lodge had already won. In a desperate bid to escape, Claire managed to lock Ethan in the pantry, his anguished screams filling the house with a primal rage. The sound of him pounding against the wooden door sent shivers down her spine, as if the lodge itself were growling in fury. She grabbed Lucas, pulling him behind her as they fled into the blinding storm outside. The wind howled, the snow falling so thickly it was as though the very world had disappeared. All that remained was the oppressive weight of the silent lodge, its towering presence looming behind them, as though it had swallowed the world whole. The cold bit at Claire's face, her breath coming in shallow gasps as they stumbled through the drifts. But no matter how far they ran, the lodge's grip seemed to extend further, the weight of its presence like a heavy hand on her chest. Behind them, the lodge seemed to pulse, the walls groaning with an otherworldly energy. The laughter, the mocking, maddening laughter, rippled through the air, seeping into her ears as if the lodge were mocking their escape. They reached the attic, the last place they could think to hide. But what they found there made Claire's stomach turn. The bodies of previous caretakers lay frozen in the corners, their once human faces now frozen masks of terror. Their eyes, wide open, unblinking, stared back at her, the silent screams of their souls trapped within, echoes of the lodge's curse. The air in the attic was thick with death, and Claire knew, with a chilling certainty, that these people hadn't just died, they had been claimed. As the storm raged on outside, Ethan's tortured screams from within the lodge grew louder, desperate and filled with madness. Claire couldn't help but wonder if he had already succumbed to whatever malevolent force had claimed the others. She clutched Lucas tightly to her chest, her heart racing as the walls around them seemed to close in, the shadows thickening with every passing second. And then, with a deafening crack, the door to the attic burst open. Ethan stood there, his face pale, his eyes wild with terror, but it was too late. The lodge had already taken him. His gaze fixed on Claire, hollow and vacant, as if he was no longer the man she had married. There was only a puppet, a vessel, carrying out the will of the silent lodge.
The lodge needs us, Claire.
He whispered, his voice like a distant echo.
It won't let us leave. It never lets us leave.
Claire's heart stopped. She saw the madness in his eyes, the same madness that had consumed the others. She knew she had to act fast. There was no reasoning with him now. In that moment, Claire's mind snapped to a sudden, horrific realization: the lodge was alive. Not just in the physical sense, but in the spiritual one. It fed on isolation. It thrived on fear. And the more it took, the more it lived. Her only hope was to destroy it, to burn it down and end its reign of terror. With a surge of desperate strength, Claire grabbed Lucas and bolted out of the attic, her eyes scanning the dark halls for a way out. The walls seemed to pulse, contracting and expanding like the chest of some ancient beast. The lodge was alive, and it wasn't going to let them go without a fight. They raced through the darkened halls, the shadows reaching out like grasping hands, the whispers growing louder, more urgent. Claire knew the lodge could hear them now. The walls shook as though the house itself was waking up, and the ghosts of the past seemed to stir in the corners of her vision. They reached the grand ballroom, the vast room frozen in time. The once beautiful space was now a twisted mockery of its former self. Ghostly figures, dressed in tattered 1920s attire, drifted silently through the room. Their eyes, hollow, vacant, followed Claire and Lucas as they stepped inside, their presence as cold and oppressive as the air around them.
The lodge demanded blood, and it would not be denied.
The floor beneath them seemed to tremble as the ghosts of the past rose up, their mournful wails mixing with the laughter that had been echoing through the halls. The lodge's power was overwhelming now, its grip on them tightening like a vice. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thick with an ancient, suffocating presence. But Claire refused to give in. She knew she had one last chance to end this. With a burst of desperation, Claire spotted the curtains draped across the windows, thick, heavy fabric that had once blocked the light but now could serve as a torch. She grabbed a candle from a nearby table, lighting the wick with trembling hands. She hurled the candle at the curtains, and in an instant, flames roared to life, licking the air, crackling as they consumed the fabric. The fire spread like wildfire, rapidly engulfing the room. The lodge seemed to scream in pain, its walls groaning and shaking as if they were being ripped apart. But it was too late. The flames had taken hold, and the silent lodge was burning. With Lucas in her arms, Claire ran into the storm, her feet slipping in the snow as the fire lit their path. The smoke curled into the sky, the flames casting eerie shadows against the snow. Behind them, the lodge roared in fury, the fire swallowing its haunted halls, its ghostly inhabitants screaming as they were consumed. But just as Claire thought they were free, she turned to glance back one last time. Through the smoke, she saw Ethan. His face was calm, a twisted smile curling at the corners of his mouth. He stood in the heart of the flames, untouched by the fire, his eyes fixed on her as though he were waiting for something, waiting for her to understand. And then, in the briefest of moments, the flames seemed to flicker, revealing a shadow behind Ethan, an outline that was far too large, far too dark. It loomed over him, towering like a dark cloud. The lodge wasn't just a house. It was something far older, something far darker. Ethan's smile faded as the shadow swallowed him whole. As Claire and Lucas stumbled away, the wind howled, and the snow fell heavier, the dark figure of the silent lodge's true master fading into the blizzard. Years later, as Claire and Lucas tried to rebuild their lives, the memories of that night still haunted them. The whispers, the voices, they were always there, faintly. The snow would fall every winter, and Claire would feel the weight of the silent lodge pressing against her once again. But it was the final discovery that would stay with her. One day, while cleaning out the attic of their new home, Claire found a box of old papers. Inside, she discovered Ethan's manuscript, the one he had worked on relentlessly before the lodge claimed him. The pages were burnt around the edges, but the words were still legible. It contained only one sentence, repeated over and over again.
It never ends.
And that was when she understood. The silent lodge had never truly been destroyed. It had merely been waiting. And it was still watching. Still whispering. Still waiting for the next soul to feed it. Somewhere, deep in the wilderness, the snow began to fall again. And the silent lodge waited.